Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be giving you a lesson on shadow work for beginners. Okay, so today I'm going to be giving you a lesson on shadow work for complete beginners. We're going to go over what the shadow is, what shadow work is, and how to begin with shadow work. I'm basically going to be giving you the guide that I would have liked to have had 11 years ago when I started with my own shadow work practice. So first, let's start with a definition of what the shadow is. So the shadow is basically a term that was coined by Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, and it refers to all the parts of the personality that we've rejected and repressed that we're unconscious to. And oftentimes when I talk to people about the shadow or I hear people talking about the shadow online, oftentimes it's depicted as kind of this dark, negative, shadowy other figure that's lurking around in the shadows, but that's not exactly accurate to the realities of what the shadow is. Really, a more helpful way to think about the shadow is that it's a place within the psyche where we put the repressed aspects of the personality. So it's basically like a dark closet in the psyche where we put aspects that we're either unwilling or unable to be present with at a given time. So let's say that we have the conscious personality, which the conscious personality is basically the part of ourself that we identify with. It's the part of ourself that we call I or me. And whenever we are either unable or unwilling to be present with certain aspects of the conscious personality, we fragment those parts of ourselves off and we put them into the shadow to forget about them. This is called repression. And when we repress these parts of ourselves, these aspects become autonomous from the conscious personality, which means that in the same way that the conscious personality has its own wants, needs, and agendas, each of these aspects that we place in the shadow have their own wants, needs, and agenda, and essentially function as their own little mini personalities. And so sometimes we as the conscious personality might want to go in one direction in our life, but these aspects could want to go in the totally opposite direction. So this oftentimes causes a lot of inner turmoil, procrastination, and self-sabotage. And when we repress aspects into the shadow, we become like a vehicle with many steering wheels. So we have the steering wheel that's there in the driver's seat that we as the conscious personality are sitting in, and we're trying to navigate around a particular place. And maybe it's the case that we want to turn left, but we end up running into a problem because in the trunk there are 10 other hidden steering wheels, each manned by another shadow aspect. And maybe some of these aspects want to go right, or maybe some of these aspects want to stay straight. And so what this can do is it can be quite unnerving and quite puzzling and can create a lot of motivational issues because we're essentially pulling in two different directions without our awareness that we're pulling in an opposite direction. Now, when it comes to why we repress certain shadow aspects, there are four main reasons why we repress. Now, I went into this in another video, so you can check out my shadow work playlist to check that out. It's titled The 4 Reasons for Repression. But basically, the 4 reasons that we repress are to preserve an identity, to preserve a worldview, to cope with trauma, and to cope with unmet needs. So when it comes to identity preservation or worldview preservation, we'll often repress aspects to keep a hold on a cherished identity or a cherished way of looking at the world. So if I have an identity that I'm a serious person, and if I have a worldview that's like serious people are the only people who are credible people to listen to, what's going to happen is I'm probably going to repress anything in myself that's threatening to that identity. And so basically, if I have any kind of lighthearted parts of myself, I'm going to see those as very, very harmful to me because of the worldview and the identity that I hold. And so in order to maintain that identity and that worldview, I will push away anything that feels threatening or antithetical to that identity. Now, the other 2 reasons why we might repress certain aspects are less about identity and worldview and are more emotional in nature. So one is to cope with trauma and the other is to cope with unmet needs. So when it comes to coping with trauma, let's say that I experienced at the age of 5 that I lost a family member that I cared about a lot. And so this is a lot of grief for a 5-year-old to deal with or for anyone to deal with. And so if I was either unable or unwilling to look at that grief, what's going to happen is I'm going to fragment off the part of myself that's bore the brunt of that trauma around the grief, and I'm going to place it in the shadow to go selectively unconscious to it. And basically, in order to reintegrate that aspect, I'm going to have to face with that grief and actually process through it. Now, when it comes to unmet needs, this is also for the sake of keeping us away from really intense emotions. Whenever we have a certain emotional or psychological need, it's going to be really, really intense if we're conscious of the part of ourselves that has that need, because we're going to feel the feeling of desperation. So for example, if I, as a child, really, really needed validation from my family, and yet my family was either unwilling or unable to give that to me, well, ultimately, that's going to be really, really painful to be in touch with the part of myself that has that need, because there's just no way to get that need met. I have no control. And so I either have two options. One is to be aware of the desperation constantly and to have that be a constant weight on myself, or to repress away the part of myself that has that need. And, I might even create an identity and a worldview where I identify as someone who doesn't need any validation, who doesn't care what other people think. But basically, that would be one reason why I might repress an aspect as well. So those are the 4 reasons why we might repress something. And now I want to give a quick caveat about the shadow. So oftentimes we kind of look at the shadow as though it's something negative, or the aspects of ourselves that we push into the shadow as something inherently negative. But ultimately, neither of these parts of ourself are negative. So the shadow as a place is basically like a vital organ of the psyche that actually helps us function. So if we're able to go selectively unconscious to something, we're able to sort of move forward with our life. We're able to maintain a sense of homeostasis. So the shadow is actually quite a benefit to us, even though there can be some side effects to having a shadow that can cause some problems. And the same thing is true of the shadow aspects. So the parts of ourself that we repress into the shadow, there's nothing inherently negative about them. It's just that we've either judged them as negative because of our identity or our worldview, or we've had to repress them because they've dealt with some kind of trauma or some kind of unmet need. So there's nothing inherently negative about these aspects. And so whenever it's the case that we integrate them, what we want to do is we want to find the most positive expression that we can find relative to these parts. But of course, oftentimes aspects from the shadow can cause us to behave in negative ways. And this is for a variety of reasons. One is because these aspects are disjointed from the rest of the personality. So whenever we push aspects into the shadow, it loses the sense of connection with all the other elements of the personality. And so when these aspects make decisions about which direction to go in, they're often doing so from a short-sighted and limited perspective. And so oftentimes they don't make the best decisions. Also, whenever these aspects are repressed, they tend to stay at the stage of development they were at when they were repressed. So if I repressed an aspect at the age of 3, it's going to be dealing with situations in the same way that we could expect a 3-year-old to deal with them. And so oftentimes, even though our shadow aspects all have positive, benevolent intentions toward ourself because they are ourself and they have a fundamental self-interest, oftentimes the way they'll try to go about meeting their needs or moving toward what they want is indirect because they're in the shadow, but also short-sighted because they don't get access to the rest of the personality, and they can oftentimes be quite young and immature in the way that they handle certain situations. So with this in mind, it makes sense why people associate the shadow with negative things, but the reality is that the shadow is not negative at all. And so when we're doing shadow work, we want to work with the wisdom of the shadow and not against it. So with all these explanations out of the way about what the shadow is, what is shadow work? Well, shadow work in simplest terms is basically taking the parts of ourself that we've repressed away and put it in the dark closet of the psyche, taking them out and reincorporating them back into the conscious personality. So if we can think about the conscious personality as a place and the shadow as a place, what we're basically doing is we're taking those parts of ourself out of the shadow and we're placing them back into the other place that is our conscious personality. So it's about becoming aware of our shadow aspects, being able to explore them deeply, and then finding ways to weave them back into our personality. So when it comes to why we might want to practice shadow work, the benefits of shadow work are many. So we can use shadow work to let go of unhealthy coping mechanisms. We can use shadow work to get rid of self-sabotaging behaviors. And we can use shadow work even to break unhealthy patterns in relationships. And those are just a few different things. But really, when I think about the benefits of the shadow, I think about them in 2 different categories. There are linear benefits to shadow work and there are non-linear benefits benefits to shadow work. So in terms of the linear benefits, it's basically like this, like we're dealing with a problem, we integrate the aspect of ourself that's causing that problem, and then we no longer have to deal with that problem. So it's like I'm down in the hole, and then I use shadow work to get myself up out of the hole. And that's a perfectly valid way to look at shadow work, and you can certainly benefit a lot by looking at shadow work that way. But since I've been doing it for about 11 years, my relationship to shadow work has shifted such that my main focus is more toward the nonlinear benefits of shadow work. So instead of thinking of it as how can I use shadow work to solve my problems, I think about it more as like how can I use shadow work to deepen and enrich my relationship to myself and to reality at large. And currently, the way that I'm orienting to shadow work is that I see it as this unending cyclical dance between my conscious mind and my unconscious mind, and between my internal world and the external world, that enables me to access deeper and deeper layers of myself. And since starting with shadow work, it's totally recontextualized my relationship to my past traumas and my pain, and has helped me really accept those as part of my life. And right now, shadow work is much less about fixing and improving myself and much more about loving myself and accepting myself. So one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that shadow work is fundamentally a self-love practice. And while self-improvement and the fixing of problems can come about as a result of shadow work, it's far more about being able to love and accept ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, before we get into the practicalities of how to do shadow work, I want to share with you a few safety tips. And the reason why is that whenever we're working with aspects that have been made unconscious to us, there's often very good reason why these aspects have been repressed. So whenever we repress parts of ourself into the shadow, it's oftentimes because they're dealing with really, really intense emotions that are challenging and overwhelming to be present to. So we all have a limited amount of emotional bandwidth, and if we experience something that's too intense, oftentimes we will repress something. So we always want to take it very gradually. But let me go ahead and I'll share some tips with you to make sure that your shadow work journey is as smooth as possible. So my first safety tip regarding shadow work is to take things slowly. So as you start to access new parts of yourself, you want to maybe challenge yourself, but you don't want to push past your limits. So you always want to listen to your body and listen to your intuition and not push yourself into feelings just because you think, oh, this is going to help me access my shadow more. So I want to take things very slowly. All right, my second safety tip for shadow work is to have a grounding practice in place. So basically, when it comes to accessing our shadow aspects, if we end up tapping into some emotions that are way too intense to deal with, that cause a great deal of emotional dysregulation, we want to be able to anchor our awareness into something else that's going to enable us to become more emotionally regulated. And typically that's done by being able to ground our awareness in something of the sensory experiences. So that helps us get away from our thoughts, and it allows us to get away from our inner world if it becomes too intense. So one such grounding practice is the process called listing. And so listing is basically where we look around the room and we label out different things that we see. So maybe if I'm looking around my room, I'm like, that's a bed, that's a bookshelf, that's a book, that's a notebook. And so when we can do this, what we're doing is we're pulling our attention off of really uncomfortable feelings that are coming up that are too intense to deal with, and we're putting our attention elsewhere so that those feelings start to calm down. All right, so safety tip number 3 is to, if you have fairly benign coping mechanisms that you notice yourself using, let them stay there. Don't try to weed them out right away. So basically, if you have a coping mechanism, like maybe I was very achievement oriented and I was using that as a coping mechanism, like letting it stay there isn't going to cause a problem. Now, when it comes to other harmful coping mechanisms that are going to be, let's say, to your detriment, things like, various addictions and things like this, then you'll want to seek help for those things to be able to let go of that coping mechanism, because it's not a helpful one. It's quite a harmful one. But if you have a fairly benevolent or benign coping mechanism, let it stay there and just try to deal with the root of why you feel like coping in the first place. So what happened to me back when I was 20, before I knew anything about shadow work, is I became aware that a lot of my tendencies toward achievement achievement and wanting to be better and better. And it was even like kind of verging on a kind of workaholism. All of that was really based off of me trying to get away from deep feelings of self-hatred. So my idea at the time was that, oh, if I can, let's say, achieve this and do that, and I can look at these positive things that I can do, I can feel better about myself. And so when I noticed that these drives were coming from self-hatred, I recognized that my tendencies toward achievement were really just a coping mechanism. And what I tried to do is I tried to toss away that coping mechanism. And what ended up happening is that for a couple years afterward, I really floundered in life because that coping mechanism was actually bearing a lot of weight. It was really, really important for me to engage in that at the time. So if I were to go back in time and I were to give my 20-year-old self some advice, what I would recommend to her is to let the achievement-oriented coping mechanism be there, but just face directly with the feelings of self-hatred. And if you face with things directly at the root and you resolve those things, eventually the coping mechanism will drop away, and whatever genuine motivations I would have had toward, let's say, my achievement orientation, would have stayed, and then the more shadow motivations would have fallen away. So I recommend don't kick your crutches out from under you. You might really genuinely actually need them. Okay, so let's go into how to begin with shadow work. So my advice for complete beginners would be to identify your shadow aspects and explore them at a deep level. Now, of course, that's by no means an exhaustive way to practice shadow work, but it is a great start, and it's very, very easy to start this way. Now, when it comes to identifying and naming your shadow aspects, this can seem tricky at first glance. And the reason why this can seem tricky is because when aspects are in the shadow, we're unconscious to them. So how can we identify and name something that we're not even conscious of? Now, the solution here is to name our aspects based off of the symptoms that they're showing. So basically, the symptoms that are coming up above the surface of consciousness that we're aware that we're engaging in, we can name off shadow aspects based off of those and explore those deeper to the roots. So for example, if I notice myself people-pleasing, I might go, maybe that could be motivated by a certain shadow aspect. And so I might want to name off that aspect people-pleaser emerald. And so this gives me an aspect of myself that I can explore into for a deeper insight. Now, to give an analogy of what we want to do, I like to think about, let's say, pinpointing out our aspects a bit like a root vegetable. So let's take a carrot, for example. So the orange part of the carrot grows up underneath the ground, and the leaves stick out above the ground. And when we're, let's say, looking around for carrots, we won't actually be looking around for the orange vegetable because that part is something that we don't see. It's something that's underneath the ground. But the leaves, if we can find a way to identify the carrot's leaves, we can find those leaves and use those leaves to pull up the carrot. The shadow works the same way. So if we have a given shadow aspect, it's like the root part, the orange part of the carrot. It's underneath the surface of consciousness in the same way that the carrot is growing below the ground, but the leaves stick up above the surface. And so if we can find the symptoms or the leaves of our shadow aspects, we can then explore those and use those leaves to pull up that root. And one of the things that you'll notice about this analogy when it comes to the leaves in the carrot being analogous to the symptoms of a shadow aspect versus the shadow aspect itself is that the leaves in the carrot look quite different. They're a totally different color, they're a totally different appearance. And so when it comes to being able to pinpoint out our shadow aspects, we have to understand that what might be coming up above the surface of consciousness might look quite different from what's below the surface of consciousness. For example, if I find myself constantly engaging in a cycle where I experience extreme anger and I'm raging out at people pretty frequently and maybe throwing tantrums, or I get triggered into that state pretty frequently, well, I can name off an aspect for that. Maybe I would call it rageful emerald. And ultimately, those are the leaves that poke up above the surface. There's something that I'm aware that I'm engaging in. But maybe if I explore down underneath, I find that the roots of that, the actual shadow aspect, might look quite different. So it could actually be an aspect of myself that feels hurt or powerless. So it can look very, very different underneath the surface compared to what's popping up above the surface. But we can use those surface level symptoms to explore these aspects to their deeper roots. So with that said, as you go to identify and name your shadow aspects, I recommend naming your aspects based off of the symptom plus your first name. So for example, if I have an aspect that's raging out all the time, that's maybe rageful emerald. Or if I have an aspect that's people-pleasing, that would be people-pleasing emerald. Or if I have an aspect that feels insecure sometimes, that could be insecure emerald. Now, when it comes to identifying your shadow aspects by their symptoms, there are four main categories of symptoms that I like to look at. So we have agendas, behaviors, coping mechanisms, and emotional states. So when it comes to naming off your aspects based off of an agenda is basically a certain goal that you might have. Now, when it comes to the goals that we have, we can look directly at things first that we might not necessarily be so happy we have this particular goal, but we could really work with any particular goal to explore it for shadow aspects underneath. And it's really, really important to be very honest with yourself about your goals, because if you maybe have a certain idea of yourself as like, oh, I don't want to have that goal, or that goal is not a good goal, then we can be a little bit self-deceptive. Like, so for example, when I was a teenager, it was really an important part of my identity or my beliefs about myself that I didn't care what other people think. And yet, if I look back, I cared a great deal what other people thought. So if I wanted to work with an aspect of myself that cares what other people think, I have to be very honest and actually admit that to myself. So basically looking for the agendas first that we maybe are a little bit uncomfortable with or don't necessarily want to have. And we can also look at other types of agendas too. But let's say that if I find myself, let's say, wanting to know everything, I could call that aspect know-it-all emerald. Or if I have an aspect of myself that's trying to impress other people, that could be something like redemption arc emerald or proving myself to others emerald. So it's sort of like looking for these different goals that we might have either consciously or semi-consciously, and being able to pinpoint out shadow aspects based off of that so that we can explore them more deeply. Now, the second category that I like to use to pinpoint out potential shadow aspects is to look at behaviors. And basically, behaviors are just noticing the ways that you generally act, noticing your general MO. So for example, if I find myself getting distracted a lot, I might call that aspect distracted emerald. Or if I find myself procrastinating on things, I might name that aspect procrastinator emerald. Now, the third category of symptoms that I like to look at are coping mechanisms. And coping mechanisms are a subset of behaviors. They're a type of behavior that we do usually to make let's say, a suboptimal situation more bearable. So for example, if I find myself coping by engaging in a bad habit, what I might do is I might label that off based off of the bad habit plus my name. So if I notice myself being on social media all the time as a way of coping with things, I could name that off social media emerald. Or if I find myself engaging in a particular substance addiction, let's say I'm addicted to alcohol, I call that aspect alcoholic emerald. Or I might engage in something like biting my nails or something like that, so nail biting emeralds. Or maybe another coping mechanism I have is pushing people away and being socially avoidant. I could call that aspect social avoidance emerald. And the fourth and final category of symptoms that you would want to look at to pinpoint potential shadow aspect is feeling states. Looking at feeling states that tend to have a pattern of coming up. Like, so what I had mentioned earlier, like if I find myself experiencing a lot of anger and rage, I might name this rageful emerald or angry emerald. Or if I feel feelings of insecurity coming up frequently, I could call that aspect insecure emerald. So basically, to name and identify your shadow aspects, you'll want to look at your day-to-day MO, looking at the different agendas, behaviors, coping mechanisms, and feeling states that you frequently have, and you can create a big list of shadow aspects. And this gives you a lot to work with in terms of what you can explore. And so in the same way that we talked about our carrot earlier, it gives you lots of leaves to grab a hold of to uproot and unearth your shadow aspects. So here are some initial questions regarding each category of symptoms that you can begin to ask yourself to start to explore your shadow aspects. And so we'll begin with an example about a shadow aspect that's been named for a particular agenda. So for example, if I notice myself trying to impress people, and maybe I've labeled this aspect off, impressing people emeralds. And basically what I want to ask myself is how impressing people is meant to serve me. And so maybe if I'm thinking about the different ways that impressing people could serve me, maybe it's about going towards something, like maybe it helps me feel important, or maybe it helps me feel a sense of connection. Or maybe it's about getting away from something. Maybe it's something like getting away from lack of belonging or getting away from feeling unimportant. And from there, once I get my answer, I want to ask another question in relation to that answer. And whatever answer I get from there, I want to ask another question in relation to that answer. So it always goes question, answer, question based off of the previous answer, and so on and so on and so on. So if I ask myself the question, how am I trying to serve myself by impressing people, and I get the answer that it's to make me feel more important, then I can ask another question from there. I might ask, oh, do I not already feel important? And if the answer is, let's say, no, I don't feel important, I might ask myself, well, why don't I feel important? When did I start feeling unimportant? So we can ask ourselves a variety of questions to essentially go from the symptoms and explore them deeper down to the root. And so you want to use this string of questions to ladder yourself down deeper and deeper. Now I'll give you the initial questions that you can ask for each category of symptoms. So the first category is agendas. And the question that you want to ask yourself is, how am I trying to serve myself by enacting this agenda? Now, the second category is behaviors. And the question is, what's motivating me to engage in this behavior? Now, when it comes to coping mechanisms, you want to ask yourself, what is this coping mechanism helping me cope with? And when it comes to feeling states, I want to ask myself, first, when did I first start feeling this way? And again, once you get your answer to that, you want to create new questions that come about that help you get deeper and deeper and ladder down to the roots of your shadow aspect. Now, this video is by no means an exhaustive understanding of what shadow work is, but it does give a complete beginner a really solid starting point for their shadow work practice. So you can begin working with your shadow by identifying your shadow aspects and then exploring them deeper with more and more and more questions. And if you want to learn more about the shadow, you can check out my shadow work playlist. All right, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button below and subscribe. And also, if you wanted to learn more about the shadow, I have a free 60-minute shadow work masterclass. And so basically, you would just have to go to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. It's totally free. Just put in your email and you'll get instant access to the masterclass. So if that's something you're interested in, I recommend checking it out. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.